Midnight in the Appalachian highlands. Summersville Lake lies still as black glass. 60 feet below the surface, stone foundations sit squared against the mud. Roadbeds trace paths through the darkness. Rock carvings, initials, dates, declarations of love remain legible after 6 decades underwater. And somewhere in the silt, children's marbles wait to be found. Glass eyes staring up at a sun they haven't seen since 1966. This was Gad, West Virginia, a farming community erased to build a dam. The government came. The water rose. 100 families were told to leave or drown. They called it flood control. They called it progress. They called it necessary. The people who lived here called it home. Was the drowning of Gad an act of salvation or an act of theft? Chapter 1. The Wound in the Valley. To understand what Gad was, you first have to understand what drew people to this corner of West Virginia in the first place. The Gauley River rises on Gauley Mountain in Pocahontas County, at an elevation of more than 4,000 feet above sea level. From there, it drops, and drops is the right word, nearly 4,000 feet over 104 miles, carving its way through some of the steepest, most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States. The walls of the Gauley Gorge are lined with massive rock outcrops, tangled rhododendron thickets, and forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the valley floor. For most of human history, this was land that resisted settlement. The terrain was simply too difficult. The Gauley drains nearly 1,350 square miles of watershed, including the waters of the Cherry, Meadow, Cranberry, Birch, and Williams rivers, all flowing into the main channel from the east like tributaries feeding a hungry beast. The steep-sided valleys and narrow hollows offered little flat ground for farming, and the river itself was unpredictable, prone to sudden rises that could sweep away anything built too close to its banks. The first non-native settlers didn't arrive until the end of the 1700s, when Major William Morris claimed lands in what would become Nicholas County. He brought with him an enslaved man named Peter, and it was after Peter that Peter's Creek was named, one of the few acknowledgments in the historical record of the Black Hands that helped carve civilization from this wilderness. The irony is bitter. A man held in bondage, his labor stolen, his humanity denied, remembered only in the name of a waterway that would eventually flow into a lake built on the displacement of others. Other settlers followed slowly over the decades. They came seeking what Americans have always sought in the mountains: land they could call their own, distance from the complications of the lowland world, and the promise of self-sufficiency. They built cabins in the hollows. They cleared small farms on the creek bottoms. They buried their dead in family plots on hillsides overlooking the land they'd worked. Generation after generation, they put down roots in soil that would one day lie beneath 60 feet of water. Nicholas County itself was created by the Virginia legislature on January 30th, 1818, carved from parts of Greenbrier, Kanawha, and Randolph counties. It was named for Wilson Carey Nicholas, a Virginia governor and United States senator, a man who never set foot in these mountains, whose name was attached to this place as a political gesture rather than a mark of belonging. The people who actually lived here had no say in what their home would be called. That pattern would repeat itself in different forms for the next century and a half. By the early 1800s, a small community had taken root along McKee's Creek, a tributary of the Gauley. Local tradition holds that it was named for a family called Gad, the double D eventually simplified to a single letter, as often happens with names passed down through generations of mountain speech. The Gads were among the first to stake their claim to this valley, to clear the timber and break the soil and declare that this place This particular bend in the creek would be home. The county encompassed 654 square miles of plateau and hollow, of coal seams and limestone quarries, of timber stands and fruit farms. By 1860, the population had reached 4,627, and of those, only 154 were enslaved. This was not plantation country. This was the domain of small farmers, of people who worked their own land with their own hands, who measured wealth not in acres or enslaved people, but in the quality of their tobacco crop and the health of their livestock. Chapter 2. The Shape of a Small World. Gayad was never a boom town. It never had delusions of grandeur. It was a farming community, pure and simple, a collection of families who had found a place where the soil was workable and the water was clean, and the outside world could be kept at arm's length. In the hierarchy of American settlements, God barely registered. No railroad passed through, no industry took root, no famous person was born there. It was simply a place where people lived, worked, raised their children, and died. They raised tobacco and livestock. They grew vegetables in kitchen gardens that would seem impossibly labor-intensive to modern eyes, beans and corn and squash, tomatoes and peppers, potatoes buried in root cellars to last through the winter. They lived the rhythms of agricultural life that had sustained Appalachian communities for generations, the frantic activity of planting season, the long hot days of summer cultivation, the exhausting work of harvest, the relative quiet of winter when the land lay dormant and families turned inward. The center of town, such as it was, consisted of a general store that also served as the post office, that peculiarly American institution where commerce and communication merged into a single creaking building. Here you could buy flour and sugar, nails and fabric, patent medicines and penny candy. Here you could mail a letter to a relative in Charleston or receive a catalog from Sears Roebuck. Here you could catch up on the gossip, learn who was sick and who was courting, discover what prices tobacco was fetching in the lowland markets. The general store was the heart of the community, the place where the threads of daily life wove together. There was a small school where children learned their letters and their sums, where a single teacher, often a young woman from a neighboring county, tried to prepare young minds for futures that might take them far from these hills or might keep them here forever, following in their parents' footsteps. The schoolhouse was plain, functional, built of local timber by local hands. In winter, it was heated by a wood stove that the older boys were responsible for stoking. In spring, the windows were thrown open to let in the mountain air, and lessons competed with birdsong for the children's attention. There was a church where families gathered on Sundays, where weddings and funerals marked the passages of life, where the community came together in faith and fellowship. The denomination varied depending on which account you read: Baptist, Methodist, the distinctions blurred by time and memory. What mattered was that it was their church, built by their hands, serving their spiritual needs. The preacher might have been circuit riding, shared with other small congregations in the area, or he might have been a local man called to ministry. Either way, the church was where Gayad gathered to mark the moments that mattered: births and deaths, unions and separations, the turning of the seasons of the soul. There was a sawmill that processed timber from the surrounding forests, turning the great trees of the Appalachian highlands into lumber for building, houses and barns, fences and furniture, the raw material of civilization. The scream of the saw blade was one of the sounds of daily life in Gad, as familiar as the crowing of roosters or the lowing of cattle. The sawmill meant jobs for men who didn't have enough land to farm full-time, meant cash income in an economy that often ran on barter and credit. And there were the cemeteries, 6 of them scattered across the hillsides. Family plots where generations lay side by side, where stone markers recorded the names and dates of people who had lived and died in this valley, who had chosen to be buried in the land they had worked. The Gadd family cemetery, the McKee family plot, 4 others whose names have faded from memory, but whose stones still bore testimony to lives lived in this place. These were sacred ground in the truest sense, not because any church had consecrated them, but because they held the bones of ancestors, the physical remains of the people who had made this community what it was. For more than 150 years, life in Gadd followed a pattern as predictable as the seasons. Children were born, grew up, married, had children of their own. Young men left for the cities and the coal fields. Some came back, some didn't. Young women married and moved to their husbands' farms, or stayed and brought husbands home to work their father's land. The outside world changed around them. Wars were fought, technologies invented, empires rose and fell, but in God, the essential facts of existence remained constant. Plant in spring, harvest in fall, survive the winter, repeat. Next door, connected by roads that wound through the hollows, sat the community of Sparks, another farming settlement, another collection of families bound together by geography and necessity. The 2 communities shared resources, traded labor, intermarried. They were separate but intertwined, 2 threads in the same fabric of rural Appalachian life. A young man from Gadd might court a young woman from Sparks. A farmer from Sparks might bring his grain to be ground at a mill in Gadd. The boundaries between the communities were real but permeable, administrative distinctions that meant less than the bonds of kinship and mutual aid. No one in Gadd, in all those years, could have imagined what was coming. No one could have pictured a future in which their entire community, and Sparks beside it, would be erased from the map. Not by fire or flood or plague, but by a piece of paper signed in a marble building 1,000 miles away. Chapter 3. A River That Kills. The Gauley River has always been feared. Even its name carries echoes of violence. Linguists believe it derives from the French word Gaul, the river of the Gauls, a reminder that this territory was once part of New France, before the French and Indian War redrew the map of North America. But the local pronunciation has always made it sound like something more visceral. Gauley, a word that catches in the throat, a name that sounds like a warning, and the river has given the locals reason to fear it. The historical record of flooding in Nicholas County and the Kanawha Valley reads like a catalog of disasters. The steep-sided walls of the Gauley and its tributaries channel water with terrifying efficiency. When the rains come, and in this part of Appalachia they always come, the water has nowhere to go but down. And down means through the valleys where people have built their homes and farms and lives. The same geography that made the land attractive for settlement, the flat creek bottoms, the sheltered hollows, made it vulnerable to the river's rage. In 1832, according to historical records, the first major documented flood swept through the region. The specifics have been lost to time, but the pattern was established. The river could not be trusted. In 1847, floodwaters swept through the river valleys, destroying farms and drowning livestock. Families who had spent years clearing land and building homes watched their work wash away in hours. The survivors rebuilt, because what else could they do? This was their land, their home, the place where their children had been born and their parents lay buried. In 1884, another flood came. The river rose without warning, as it always did, and claimed whatever stood in its path. Then, 1889, when the Gauley reached 32 feet above low water, 4 inches above the river basin itself. That's not a flood, that's a catastrophe. That's the river saying, everything you've built, everything you've worked for, exists only because I allow it. But the worst came in March of 1918. The winter had been brutal, the spring sudden. Unseasonal warm weather met heavy rainfall, and the Gauley became a monster. The frozen ground couldn't absorb the water. The snowpack melted all at once. Every creek and stream became a torrent, feeding the main channel. Crest stages reached 32.6 feet. The flood lasted nearly 3 days, wave after wave of destruction, as the water rose and fell and rose again. The devastation extended all the way down to the Ohio River, more than 6 feet above flood stage at some measuring points. When the waters finally receded, the valley looked like a war zone. Farms were gone, bridges were gone, roads were gone. The infrastructure of daily life had been swept away as if it had never existed. There were more floods after that. 1936. 1937, when the Ohio River at Wheeling crested at a record 55.2 feet, nearly 20 feet above flood stage, and the Kanawha at Huntington hit 69.45 feet, more than 19 feet above flood stage. These were not local events. These were regional catastrophes that affected millions of people across multiple states, that made national headlines, that prompted congressional hearings and engineering studies and federal intervention. 1954 brought summer floods that devastated Nicholas County yet again, with the Cherry River joining the Gauley in overwhelming its banks. July 18th saw water levels reach 24.8 feet on the Gauley, destroying crops that had been tended all summer, sweeping away livestock that represented years of careful breeding. After each flood, the survivors rebuilt. They had no other choice. This was their home, their land, the place where their ancestors were buried. You couldn't simply abandon a place because the river sometimes rose. The old-timers would shake their heads and say that the river had always flooded, would always flood, and a man had to learn to live with it. You built on high ground when you could. You kept your valuables where the water couldn't reach them. You accepted the occasional disaster as the price of living in country this beautiful. But far away, in the corridors of power, men with slide rules and blueprints were coming to a different conclusion. The solution, they decided, was not to live with the river. It was to control it. It was to bend the Gauley to human will, to cage it behind concrete and stone, to make it serve the needs of progress rather than the whims of weather. Chapter 4. The Flood Control Act. The idea was born in Congress in 1937, in the aftermath of some of the worst flooding in American history. The Ohio River basin had been devastated. From Pittsburgh to Cairo, communities lay in ruins. The economic losses were staggering, not just the immediate destruction of property, but the long-term costs of rebuilding, the disruption of commerce, the human suffering that couldn't be measured in dollars. Something had to be done. The federal government had to act. The Flood Control Act of 1938 authorized a comprehensive plan for the Ohio River Basin, a network of dams and reservoirs that would tame the wild rivers of Appalachia, protect downstream communities from flooding, and, not incidentally, provide jobs during the lingering years of the Great Depression. It was the New Deal writ in concrete and stone, a testament to the belief that government could reshape nature itself in the service of human welfare. One of the proposed dam sites was on the Gauley River, just upstream from where it joined the New River to form the Kanawha. The engineers had identified it as an ideal location, a narrow gorge where a relatively short dam could create a massive reservoir, controlling 803 square miles of drainage area. The topography was perfect. The geology was sound. The only obstacle was the people who happened to live there. The numbers were impressive, laid out in engineering reports and congressional testimony. The flood storage capacity would be sufficient for extensive flood control along the Kanawha River and for extended operation as a unit of the Ohio River Comprehensive Plan reservoir system, reducing flood crests along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers themselves. The average annual flood control benefits, they calculated, would exceed $3.79 million. Over time, the dam would pay for itself many times over in disasters prevented. From that point forward, the fate of Gad was sealed. The engineers had spoken. The calculations had been made. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in Washington, a map showed the proposed reservoir boundary, and inside that boundary lay the farms and homes and cemeteries of a community that had existed for more than a century. It just took more than 2 decades for the sentence to be carried out. The project languished through World War II and the early Cold War years. There were other priorities: defeating fascism, containing communism, rebuilding Europe, developing atomic weapons. The dam on the Gauley could wait. The people of Gad went about their lives, perhaps hearing rumors from time to time about the project that might someday come, perhaps choosing not to believe that anyone would really flood their valley. They planted their crops and tended their livestock and buried their dead in the family cemeteries as they had always done. But the plans never went away entirely. They remained in the files of the Army Corps of Engineers, updated periodically, refined and revised as engineering knowledge advanced. The dam was always coming. It was just a matter of time. And in 1960, that time arrived. Chapter 5. The Men Who Moved Mountains. Construction on the Summersville Dam began in February of 1960. It was, by any measure, an engineering marvel. The Corps of Engineers faced a challenge that seemed almost biblical in scope. They needed to literally move mountains and replace them in the river valley where the Gauley had flowed for thousands of years. They needed to bend one of the wildest rivers in the eastern United States to their will, to cage it behind a wall of rock and earth that would stand for centuries. The numbers tell part of the story. The finished dam would stand 390 feet high, nearly as tall as a 40-story building, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch. It would stretch 2,280 feet across the valley, more than 4/10 of a mile of engineered stone blocking the path of the river. It would be the second-largest rock-filled dam in the eastern United States, a monument to human ambition and technical capability. A rock-filled dam is different from the concrete giants that most people picture when they think of dams. Instead of a smooth wall of poured concrete, it's a massive pile of rock and earth, carefully layered and compacted, with a clay core at the center to prevent water from seeping through. From a distance, it looks almost natural, as if the valley had always ended in this great mound of stone. That was part of the design philosophy. The dam should blend with its surroundings, should seem like a feature of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. The water would be released through a tunnel 1,555 feet long, 29 feet in diameter, controlled at the lower end by 3 9-foot diameter Howell-Bunger valves. These valves could release water at rates ranging from 100 cubic feet per second, a trickle, barely enough to maintain the river downstream, to 18,000 cubic feet per second, a torrent, a controlled flood that could scour the riverbed and remind anyone watching of the power that the dam held in check. But before any of that could happen, The river had to be moved. Workers began blasting from both sides of a mountain, cutting through nearly 2,000 feet of solid rock to create a diversion tunnel. The work was dangerous, precise, and relentless. Crews worked around the clock, drilling blast holes, setting charges, clearing rubble, advancing inch by inch through stone that had been laid down millions of years before humans existed. The mountain didn't want to be moved. Every foot of progress was a battle. When the two teams finally met in the middle, the deviation was less than an inch, a testament to the engineers' skill, to the precision of their instruments, or perhaps just to good fortune. They had drilled through nearly 2,000 feet of mountain and come out exactly where they intended. The Gauley River, which had carved its own path through these mountains over millions of years, would now flow through a tunnel designed by men and built by machines. With the river diverted through this artificial channel, crews began the real work. A temporary cofferdam held back the water while excavation proceeded. In the spring of 1962, crews began scraping the riverbed down to bedrock, about 2,000 feet of earth and rock removed to reach solid foundation. They cut a trench for the clay core that would form the dam's impermeable heart, the barrier that would prevent the reservoir from slowly draining through the porous rock fill. Then, systematically, methodically, they began filling the valley with rock and earth taken from the mountaintops above. First, one mountain had to be moved and replaced in the river valley. Materials from the summits were hauled down in trucks, dumped in layers, compacted by heavy equipment. The dam rose slowly, layer by layer, a new mountain growing where no mountain had been. The dam would cost $48 million in the 1960s, equivalent to roughly $450 million today. At its peak, the project employed hundreds of construction workers, many of them locals, who found themselves in the peculiar position of building the structure that would bury their neighbors' homes. It was good work, steady work, well paid by the standards of rural Appalachia. The irony was not lost on anyone, but irony does not pay the bills. Chapter 6. The Dispossessed. Before the valley could be flooded, it had to be emptied. The Army Corps of Engineers moved methodically through God and the neighboring community of Sparks, purchasing properties from families who had lived on this land for generations. Approximately 100 residents and families were affected, 100 households who had to find new homes, new land, new communities. 100 families whose roots in this valley, in some cases stretching back more than a century, would be severed by the stroke of a pen. The relocation was handled by the Corps according to their standard procedures. Properties were appraised by government assessors who had no connection to the community, no understanding of what these particular acres meant to the people who worked them. Offers were made, based on fair market value as determined by comparable sales in the area. Deeds were transferred. The bureaucracy ground forward with the impersonal efficiency that large institutions bring to human tragedy. The historical record is sparse on the human details of this displacement. Government documents speak of property acquisition and resident relocation in the bloodless language of bureaucracy. There are no transcripts of the conversations between Corps officials and elderly farmers who were being told to leave the land their grandfathers had cleared. There are no recordings of the arguments, the tears, the resigned acceptance that must have marked these encounters. But scattered through local histories and oral traditions are hints of the trauma that unfolded. We know that some of the elders never recovered from the shock of losing their farms. Imagine being 70 years old, having spent your entire life on a piece of land your grandfather cleared from the wilderness, and being told that your home, your fields, your barn, your kitchen garden, the tree where you carved your initials as a child, The porch where you sat with your wife on summer evenings would soon be underwater. Imagine being told that you had to leave, that the government had decided your home was less important than a reservoir, that all the years of work you'd invested in this place counted for nothing against the calculations of engineers in distant offices. The government paid fair market value, they said. But what is the fair market value of a place where your children were born? What is the going rate for a view you've seen every morning for half a century? How do you put a price on the sound of the creek in spring, on the smell of the hay in summer, on the way the evening light falls across the pasture where your father taught you to ride, where you taught your own sons in turn? The economics of eminent domain do not account for such things. They cannot. A farm is not just land and buildings, it's the accumulated meaning of generations. A home is not just shelter, it's identity, memory, belonging. You cannot write a check that compensates for the loss of these things, no matter how many zeros it contains. And then there were the dead to consider. 6 family cemeteries lay within the flood zone, 6 burial grounds where generations of Gad's residents had been laid to rest, where stone markers recorded the names and dates of people who had lived and died in this valley, who had chosen to be buried in the land they had worked. The Gad family cemetery, the McKee family plot, 4 others whose names have faded from most records, but whose stones still bore testimony to lives lived and ended in this place. These could not simply be left to the rising waters. Whatever the government's power to take land for public purposes, there were limits. The dead had rights too, or at least their descendants did. The Corps of Engineers organized the exhumation and relocation of the graves, a process that must have been wrenching for the families involved. Surveys were conducted to identify every burial site. Next of kin were located and consulted, asked to sign agreements authorizing the removal of their ancestors' remains. Legal documents were prepared, procedures followed, everything done according to regulation. Then the digging began. Coffins were unearthed from soil where they had rested for decades, sometimes more than a century. Wood had rotted, metal had rusted, but the remains inside were carefully gathered, documented, transferred to new containers. Headstones were photographed, cleaned, repaired where necessary. Everything was transported to new plots on higher ground, beyond the reach of the rising waters, where the dead could rest undisturbed, unless, of course, another dam should someday be built. It was done correctly, by the book, with all proper respect for the dead. The Corps had experience with such things. The Tennessee Valley Authority had relocated more than 20,000 graves during the construction of its dams in the 1930s and 40s. There were procedures, protocols, best practices, refined over decades of moving the dead to make way for progress. But there is something profoundly unsettling about moving a grave. There is a reason we speak of final resting places, of being laid to rest. The dead are supposed to stay where we put them. When we move them, we are admitting that nothing, not even death, is permanent. We are acknowledging that the promises we make to the departed, the assurance that they will rest forever in the place we have chosen for them, are contingent on the decisions of strangers in Chapter 7, The Dam They Couldn't Name. In the summer of 1966, as the dam neared completion, a peculiar debate arose: what to name the project. Tradition held that dams should be named for the nearest community. This was standard practice for the Army Corps of Engineers, a way of grounding these massive federal projects in local identity, of acknowledging that the dam belonged not just to the nation, but to the specific place where it stood. The nearest community to the new dam was Gad. This presented an obvious problem. The name Gad Dam would inevitably be heard as something other than a geographical designation. In an era before internet humor and meme culture, the core of engineers was still keenly aware of how names could be misinterpreted, mocked, turned into jokes that would undermine the dignity of federal infrastructure projects. The story has become part of local lore, repeated with varying degrees of embellishment. Some say engineers presented the name to committees in Washington only to be met with stunned silence and barely suppressed laughter. Others claim the alternative name, Gauley Dam, was briefly considered, but it faced the same phonetic problem. Gauley Dam, sounding too much like an exclamation of frustration when spoken quickly. In the end, they settled on the next nearest town, Summersville, the county seat, located several miles from the dam site. The Summersville Dam, the Summersville Lake. Respectable names, dignified names, names that could be spoken in congressional hearings without anyone cracking a smile. But these names also erased the town of Gad from the map while leaving it perfectly preserved beneath the surface. It was a final indignity, perhaps, to sacrifice a community and then deny it even the memorial of a name. The dam that drowned Gad would not bear witness to what it had destroyed. Visitors would come to Summersville Lake without ever knowing that another town had stood here first. Names have a way of persisting, though, despite official attempts to replace them. Today, a local brewery called Gad Dam Brewing has reclaimed the joke. They serve what they call the best Gad Dam beer east of the Mississippi, and they tell the story of the drowned town to anyone who asks. The brewery has become a kind of unofficial memorial, keeping the old name alive through irreverence rather than solemnity. Every pint sold is a small act of remembrance. On September 3, 1966, President Lyndon Baines Johnson traveled to the small town of Summersville, West Virginia, to dedicate the completed dam and reservoir. It was a significant moment, the President of the United States, at the height of his power, visiting this remote corner of Appalachia to celebrate what he called a triumph of progress and planning. Johnson arrived with his entourage, his Secret Service detail, his coterie of reporters and photographers. The local officials and residents gathered to witness history. This was their dam now, built with federal dollars but belonging to their region, a structure that would define Nicholas County for generations to come. Johnson's remarks emphasized the project's role in flood prevention and regional development. He spoke of the benefits that would flow to downstream communities along the Gauley and Kanawha rivers, communities that would never again face the devastation of an uncontrolled Gauley and flood. He praised the engineers and workers who had accomplished this feat of construction. He did not mention GAD by name. He did not acknowledge the families who had been displaced, the graves that had been moved, the community that had been erased to make this moment possible. Perhaps he didn't know the details. Perhaps he simply saw no political advantage in dwelling on such things. The dam was a triumph, and triumphs are for celebrating, not for second-guessing. As Johnson spoke, water was already beginning to accumulate behind the dam. The Gauley River, blocked for the first time in its existence, was slowly, inexorably filling the valley. The roads that had once connected GAD to the outside world were disappearing beneath the surface. The foundations of homes, the walls of the general store, the floors of the church and the schoolhouse were vanishing into the deepening water. Within weeks, the reservoir reached its intended level. Summersville Lake was born, 2,790 acres of surface water at its summer pool elevation of 1,652 feet above sea level. 60 miles of shoreline ranging from quiet coves to dramatic cliffs. Depths reaching 327 feet, deeper than a football field is long. The largest lake in West Virginia. And at the bottom of it all, preserved in darkness and cold and silence, the town of GAD. Chapter 8: The Mathematics of Sacrifice. Here is the calculus that justified the drowning. By 1974, just 8 years after its completion, the Summersville Dam had already paid for itself, not through recreation or tourism, but through damage prevented. The Corps of Engineers calculated that the reservoir had saved almost $67 million in potential flood damages. That's more than the $48 million the project cost to build. In purely economic terms, the dam was already in the black. Consider those numbers for a moment. In 8 years, the dam prevented flooding that would have exceeded its construction cost. Every year after that was pure benefit. Billions of dollars in damages that never occurred, in homes that weren't destroyed, in lives that weren't lost, in communities that weren't devastated by the unchecked fury of the Gauley and flood. Today, that cumulative figure has grown to more than $1.6 billion in flood damages averted. The dam has performed exactly as designed, capturing spring floods, moderating water levels, protecting the communities downstream that would otherwise have been devastated by the Gauley's periodic rampages. Every time a major storm system moves through the region, every time the rivers rise and threaten to overflow their banks, the Summersville Dam absorbs the blow. The reservoir swells, the water is held back, and downstream communities that remember the floods of the past sleep soundly through the night. In 2001, an 80-megawatt hydroelectric plant was added to the below dam area, generating clean energy from the water releases. The power plant can generate electricity at peak flow, contributing to the regional grid without the emissions of a fossil fuel plant. The dam doesn't just prevent destruction, it creates energy, turning the same river that once ravaged the valley into a source of power for homes and businesses across the region. The reservoir attracts nearly 1 million visitors annually for fishing, boating, swimming, and rock climbing. The cliffs that ring the lake offer some of the finest climbing in the eastern United States, with more than 100 different routes ranging from 30 to 80 feet in height. The water itself, remarkably clear, filtered by the rocky shoreline that gives the lake its Caribbean appearance, has earned it the nickname the Little Bahamas of the East. Scuba divers come from across the country to explore depths that reach more than 300 feet. In 2023, a portion of the lake's shoreline became Summersville Lake State Park, West Virginia's newest addition to its park system. The state invested in campgrounds and boat ramps, in facilities that would draw even more visitors to the area, that would further cement the lake's place as a regional destination. By any rational measure, the decision to build the dam was correct. The needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. Progress was served. The math worked out. 100 families lost their homes so that millions could be protected from flooding, so that the regional economy could be boosted by tourism, so that clean energy could flow into the grid. But math, of course, cannot account for everything. It cannot quantify the loss of home. It cannot measure the value of community destroyed. It cannot calculate what it means for a people to see their ancestors dug up and moved, their family land flooded, their history erased from all but memory. It cannot capture the grief of an old man watching the water rise over the fields his grandfather cleared, the anguish of a woman who will never again visit her parents' graves in the place where they were first buried. The mathematics of progress are always incomplete. They measure what can be counted and ignore what cannot. They tally costs and benefits in dollars and acre-feet, in lives saved and kilowatts generated, and they declare that the equation balances. But there are terms missing from that equation, values that never appear on any ledger, losses that compound invisibly across generations. Chapter 9: Hauntings Old and New. The area around Summersville has always had its ghosts. One of the oldest tales predates the lake by nearly a century. It concerns a place called the Ghost Ford on Laurel Creek in the shadow of Panther Mountain, southwest of town. The story first appears in local records in the 1870s and was still being told when the dam was built. According to the legend, an old Syrian peddler was making his way through the backwoods, selling dry goods and notions from a pack on his back. He was a common figure in rural Appalachia at the time, a traveling merchant who brought goods from the wider world to communities too small to support their own stores, who traded in buttons and thread and patent medicines and news from distant places. He was accompanied by his pet dog, a big red collie that followed at his heels wherever he went. At the ford below Old Bethel Church, someone murdered him. He was slit in the throat. His money and his goods were taken. The crime was never solved, just another act of violence swallowed by the mountains, another death that went unpunished in a land where law enforcement was sparse and grudges could fester for generations. They killed the dog, too, cutting its throat from ear to ear, leaving no witnesses to the crime. The peddler's ghost never returned. Perhaps he had no attachment to this place, no reason to linger in the mountains where he had met his end. But the dog's ghost did. People walking toward the ford at night would see it. A collie, blood red, trotting along beside them about 3 feet off the ground. It made no sound. It cast no shadow. It paid no attention to the laws of gravity, to the constraints that bound living creatures to the earth. It simply walked through the air, accompanying travelers to the place where its master had died, then vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. It wouldn't have been so bad, people said, if the dog had simply walked beside you. But there was something profoundly wrong about seeing a hound floating through the darkness, its paws treading empty air, its eyes fixed on some destination only it could see. The dog was still loyal, still following the path its master had walked, but its master was gone, and the dog didn't seem to know it. Skeptics blamed fog and moonlight, or a real stray dog glimpsed through mist and panic, fear filling in the blanks where facts were scarce. The story has largely been forgotten now, overtaken by newer legends, by the concerns of the living rather than the dead. But it establishes something important about this region. These mountains have always harbored ghosts. The veil between the living and the dead has always been thin in the Appalachian highlands, where the mist rises from the valleys and the forest closes in, and the old ways persist longer than elsewhere. When a town is drowned, where do its spirits go? There is another ghost associated with Summersville, though whether she haunts the lake or merely haunts the history books is a matter of debate. Her name was Nancy Hart. She was born around 1843, probably in Virginia. By the time the Civil War began, she was living with her family in what would become West Virginia, in territory bitterly divided between Union and Confederate sympathies. Brother fought against brother here. Neighbors who had shared harvests and church pews took up arms against each other. Nancy's brother-in-law, a Confederate supporter, was taken from his home by Union soldiers for questioning. His body was found along the road several days later, riddled with bullets. From that moment forward, Nancy Hart devoted herself to revenge. She joined the Moccasin Rangers, a pro-Confederate guerrilla group that terrorized Union forces throughout the region. She was young, barely out of her teens, but she could ride and shoot as well as any man. More importantly, she knew these mountains intimately. Every trail, every hollow, every hiding place was familiar to her from childhood. She became a SPY, using what the historical markers delicately call her charms to gather intelligence about enemy troop movements. She was so effective that the Northern government eventually offered a reward for her capture. In the summer of 1862, she was caught. Union troops under Lieutenant Colonel William Starr brought her to Summersville and imprisoned her there. An itinerant photographer took her picture. The famous image shows a young woman with a hard face and harder eyes, wearing a military-style hat that her captors had placed on her head as a kind of joke. Nancy was not amused. She talked her young guard into letting her examine his pistol, playing the naive girl, perhaps curious about the weapon. Then she shot him dead with his own gun, jumped out the window, and escaped on Colonel Starr's horse. A week later, on July 25, 1862, she returned. Nancy Hart led 200 Confederate cavalry into Summersville at dawn. They stormed the town, burned multiple buildings, captured Colonel Starr and several other officers. It was one of the most audacious raids of the entire war, a teenage girl escaping from her captors and returning with an army to burn the town that had held her prisoner. There is a historical marker commemorating her on the courthouse lawn in Summersville today. She has become a folk hero in the region, a symbol of defiance and determination. But one has to wonder, what would Nancy Hart think of GAD? Of a government that could purchase an entire community, dig up its dead, flood its land, and call it progress? Of families forced from their homes not at gunpoint, but at the point of a pen, offered fair market value for places that could not be valued in money? Chapter 10. The Battle Above the Waters. It is worth remembering that this land has witnessed violence before. On September 10, 1861, more than a century before the dam was built, the Battle of Carnifex Ferry was fought on the cliffs above what is now the lake. In the opening months of the Civil War, Western Virginia was contested ground. The people of these mountains had little in common with the plantation owners of the Tidewater. When Virginia voted to secede, many in the West refused to follow. They had no stake in slavery, no interest in defending an institution that benefited only the wealthy. Union and Confederate forces struggled for control of the transportation routes, the mountain passes, the strategic crossroads that would determine who held the region. 2,000 Confederate soldiers under General John Floyd, a former Virginia governor and former United States Secretary of War, had crossed the Gauley River and established a defensive position on a bluff overlooking the water. The place was called Carnifex Ferry, named for a local family. Floyd's men built parapets 350 feet long, protected their flanks with breastworks curving back to cliffs along the river gorge. It was a strong position, nearly impregnable if properly defended. General William Rosecrans brought 7,000 Federal troops against them. The battle lasted most of a day, a confused affair of charges and countercharges, of regiments getting lost in the thick woods, of orders going astray, and attacks arriving piecemeal. Rosecrans sent in his brigades as they arrived, the 10th Ohio, the 13th Ohio, the 3rd Ohio, allowing the outnumbered Confederates to repel each assault in turn. When night fell, Floyd slipped away across the river, leaving the field to the Union. The casualties were modest by Civil War standards: 158 Union soldiers killed or wounded, only 20 Confederates. But the strategic consequences were enormous. The Union victory at Carnifex Ferry helped secure Western Virginia for the North, keeping the Kanawha Valley under federal control and contributing directly to the creation of West Virginia as a separate state 2 years later. Today, the battlefield is preserved as Carnifex Ferry Battlefield State Park. Visitors can walk the ground where men fought and died, can look out from the cliffs over the lake that now fills the valley below. The same view that Confederate soldiers saw as they manned their parapets, The same gorge they defended with their lives is now a popular overlook for tourists admiring the beauty of Summersville Lake. It is strange to think about. A place of such violence, such significance, overlooking a lake that conceals an entirely different kind of tragedy. The soldiers who died at Carnifex Ferry are remembered, honored, their sacrifice commemorated with monuments and markers and annual reenactments. The people of Gad are mostly forgotten. Their sacrifice was less dramatic, less romantic. They didn't die for a cause, they just lost their homes. But perhaps that is its own kind of battle, a quieter one, fought with lawyers and appraisers rather than rifles and bayonets, but no less consequential for the people who lost. Chapter 11. What the Water Reveals. Every 10 years or so, the Army Corps of Engineers lowers Summersville Lake. They drain it 55 feet below normal pool level, down from the summer elevation of 1,652 feet to a winter pool of 1,575 feet to inspect the dam for damage, to perform maintenance on the infrastructure, and to ensure that the structure will continue to protect the downstream communities for decades to come. It's routine maintenance, necessary for the long-term integrity of the dam, scheduled far in advance and executed with military precision. And when they do, parts of GAD rise from the depths. Visitors during these drawdowns describe an eerie landscape. The exposed lakebed looks like a moonscape, all gray mud and exposed rock, water lines carved into the stone like the rings of a tree. Boulders that spend most of their existence underwater suddenly stand in open air, draped with dying algae, surrounded by puddles that will evaporate in the autumn sun. The familiar shape of the lake is gone, replaced by something strange and unsettling. A wound in the earth, a glimpse of what lies beneath the surface we take for granted. The roads of the old town become visible again, not as pavement, of course, but as depressions and alignments in the silt, traces of the paths that once connected neighbors to neighbors. You can see where the main road ran, can trace its route down toward where the creek used to flow. You can find the side roads that branched off to individual farms, the lanes that connected the general store to the church, the school to the cemetery. Foundations emerge from the mud, stone walls that once supported farmhouses, cellars that once stored vegetables through the winter, wells that once provided drinking water to families now scattered across the country or dead and buried in relocated cemeteries. The bones of houses, stripped of their flesh by the rising water but still bearing witness to the lives that were lived here. People come to walk where the town once stood. Some bring metal detectors, sweeping them over the mud in search of artifacts that might have been left behind in the chaos of the departure. They find things, sometimes. Marbles, children's toys, abandoned in the haste of evacuation, preserved for decades in the cold, dark water. Glass eyes staring up from the silt, waiting to be found. Buttons and buckles, fragments of pottery, hinges from doors that once opened onto kitchens where families gathered, small trinkets that once meant something to someone, now orphaned objects in a drowned world. Local historians photograph what they can, document what remains, try to piece together the layout of a community that fewer and fewer people remember firsthand. The survivors of Gad, those who were children when the waters rose, are elderly now. Their memories are precious and irreplaceable, but they are also fading, growing vaguer with each passing year. Within a decade, there may be no one left who actually lived there who can point to a particular foundation and say, "That was our house," or "That was where my grandmother baked bread on Saturday mornings." Then the inspections end, the drawdown concludes, and the water rises again. The roads disappear, The foundations vanish. The marbles and the buttons and the fragments of pottery are covered once more. Gilead returns to the depths, its brief emergence already fading into memory. Chapter 12. The Silence of the Deep. What does a drowned town sound like? Scuba divers who explore the depths of Summersville Lake report an experience that is profoundly disorienting. The clarity of the water means they can see much further than they expect. Rock formations looming out of the blue, the shapes of underwater cliffs and ledges emerging from the haze at the limits of visibility. It's like flying through a strange dream, weightless and free, surrounded by scenery that should not exist. But the silence is absolute. 300 feet below the surface, there is no bird song, no wind in the trees, no creek burbling over stones, no children laughing, no doors slamming, no voices calling across the fields. The sounds of the living world are utterly absent. Even the diver's own breathing seems intrusive, a mechanical rasp that only emphasizes the stillness surrounding it. The lake is deep enough and cold enough that stratification occurs. Below certain depths, the water is perpetually dark and frigid, untouched by the seasonal warming that affects the surface layers. Down there, where the foundations of Gad rest, it is always winter, always night. In these depths, time seems to move differently. Organic material decays slowly, if at all. Objects can be preserved for decades, in a state of suspended animation, waiting to be discovered by divers with powerful lights and a taste for the macabre. Some divers describe feeling watched. They chalk it up to the eeriness of the environment, to the knowledge that they are swimming over a buried town, to the way the human mind creates patterns and presences where none exist. Pareidolia, psychologists call it, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections in random stimuli, to see faces in clouds and hear voices in static. Others are less certain. There are stories, always second-hand, always attributed to a friend, of divers who have seen things in the depths that they cannot explain, shapes that move against the current, lights that flicker where no lights should be, faces in windows that no longer have glass. These stories cannot be verified. They probably aren't true. The cold, the darkness, the nitrogen narcosis that can affect divers at depth, all of these can play tricks on even experienced explorers. The mind sees what it expects to see or what it fears to see. And yet, the stories persist. They circulate on diving forums and Reddit threads, in conversations at bars near the lake, in the oral tradition that surrounds any place where the living and the dead come into proximity. Something about GAD refuses to stay buried. Chapter 13. The Flood That Came Anyway. On June 23, 2016, the mountains of central West Virginia received what meteorologists would later call a 1,000-year rain. Over the course of a single day, parts of Nicholas County received 5 inches of precipitation. Greenbrier County, to the south, received 9 inches, nearly a quarter of the region's annual rainfall in 24 hours. The ground, already saturated from weeks of above-average rainfall, could absorb nothing more. Every drop that fell ran immediately into the streams and rivers. National Weather Service meteorologists determined that the 24-hour rainfall totals exceeded what statistics indicated would only happen, on average, once every 1,000 years. A 1,000-year rain. The kind of event that should come once in 40 generations that most communities will never experience in all their history. But it came to West Virginia in the summer of 2016. The streams began to rise, then the rivers. The Gauley River at Camden-on-Gauley reached an all-time high of 29 feet before the recording equipment was overwhelmed. A visual inspection later put the height at 39 feet. The Elke River at Queens Shoals broke records that had stood since 1888. The Cherry River topped its banks and rose another 12 inches. Normally, tranquil streams became violent torrents, sweeping away everything in their path. At least 23 people died in the floods. Thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Homes were washed off their foundations, carried downstream like toys. Roads were closed or washed away entirely. Approximately 67,000 customers lost electricity. A state of emergency was declared in 44 of West Virginia's 55 counties. But the Summersville Dam held. The massive structure performed exactly as designed, capturing the floodwaters before they could devastate communities downstream. On the afternoon of Thursday, June 23rd, as the rivers rose and the rain continued to fall, the gates of the dam were shut to cut off water flow and store the deluge. The reservoir swelled, absorbing billions of gallons that would otherwise have swept through the Kanawha Valley, through Charleston, through the densely populated lowlands where previous floods had caused such devastation. Without the dam, the death toll would have been far higher. Without the sacrifice of Gad, the losses would have been catastrophic. The mathematics of progress, cold and impersonal as they are, proved themselves once again. The dam did exactly what it was designed to do. The investment paid off. This is the uncomfortable truth that haunts any discussion of the drowned town. The dam has saved lives. Many lives. It has prevented suffering on a scale that is difficult to imagine. The people who are alive today because of the dam, the children who grew up in homes that weren't swept away, the families that weren't shattered by loss, vastly outnumber the people who were displaced when Gad was flooded. Does that justify what was done? Can any amount of lives saved retroactively make right the displacement of 100 families, the digging up of 6 cemeteries, the erasure of a community from the map? There are no easy answers. Perhaps there are no answers at all, only questions that we carry with us, like ghosts, into the future. Chapter 14. The Weight of Forgetting. Nearly 1 million people visit Summersville Lake each year. They come for the swimming and the boating, for the fishing and the camping. They rent pontoon boats at the marina and spend lazy afternoons drifting on the clear water, trailing their fingers over the surface, feeling the sun on their faces. They pitch tents at Battle Run Campground and fall asleep to the sound of wind in the trees, to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. They come for the rock climbing. The cliffs around the lake offer some of the best climbing in the eastern United States, with routes for beginners and experts alike, with views that take your breath away even before you start your ascent. They come for the diving, for the remarkable clarity of the water, for the underwater rock formations that make every descent feel like exploring an alien landscape, for the thrill of swimming through depths that reach more than 300 feet. In September, after Labor Day, the Army Corps of Engineers begins releasing water from the dam to lower the lake for the winter. These controlled releases, 22 of them over 6 successive weekends, create some of the finest whitewater rafting in the world on the Gauley River below. The Upper Gauley offers Class 5 rapids that draw paddlers from around the world, from Europe and Australia and Japan, all coming to test themselves against water that the Corps of Engineers releases specifically for their enjoyment. It is, by any measure, a success story. The lake has become an economic engine for Nicholas County, bringing tourism dollars to a region that desperately needs them. Coal and timber, the old industries, have largely died or moved elsewhere. The recreational opportunities created by the reservoir have filled at least part of that void, sustaining businesses, creating jobs, giving young people reasons to stay in a place their parents and grandparents might have abandoned. But there is something troubling about this success. The tourists who splash in the shallows do not think about the town beneath their feet. They don't know the names of the families who once lived here, the Gadds and the McKees and all the others whose names have faded from memory. They've never heard of the general store where neighbors gathered to collect their mail and catch up on gossip. They don't know about the school where children learned to read, the church where families prayed, the cemetery where generations were buried. They paddle their kayaks over stone foundations without realizing what lies below. They dive through the crystalline water and admire the rock formations without understanding that these were once the cliffs that sheltered a community. The climbers who scale the rocks do not pause to consider the graves that were dug up and moved so they could have their sport. The rafters who hurtle through the rapids do not know the names of the elders who never recovered from losing their farms, who died broken-hearted in unfamiliar houses on unfamiliar land. It is possible to enjoy Summersville Lake without ever learning that Gadd existed, and that is, perhaps, the real tragedy, not the drowning of a town, but the forgetting of it. The people of Gadd have mostly scattered now. Their descendants live in cities and suburbs across America, pursuing lives utterly different from the agricultural rhythms that once defined existence in McKee's Creek Valley. Some of them, perhaps, still carry fragments of the old stories. Some of them, perhaps, still remember being told about the town where grandmother was born, the farm where great-uncle raised tobacco, the cemetery where the family was buried until the government came and dug everybody up. But with each passing generations, the memory fades. The stories become shorter, vaguer, harder to verify. The old photographs yellow and crack. The names on the relocated headstones become harder to read. Eventually, there will be no one left who remembers Gadd at all, no one who can point to the water and say, "My people lived there." That is how towns truly die, not when their buildings fall, but when their stories are forgotten. Night falls on Summersville Lake. The summer tourists have gone home. The boats are moored at the marina, bumping gently against the docks. The campgrounds are quiet except for the rustle of wind through the trees. 60 feet below the surface, the town of Gadd rests in darkness. The stone foundations are still there, squared against the mud as they have been for 6 decades. The roadbeds still trace their paths, marking the routes that once connected neighbors to neighbors. The rock carvings, initials, dates, declarations of love are still legible, though no one living can identify the hands that made them. In the silt, scattered like offerings, are the small objects of daily life: buttons and buckles, fragments of pottery, hinges from doors that once opened onto kitchens where families gathered, and somewhere, perhaps, children's marbles, glass eyes staring upward at a sun they haven't seen since September 1966. Are these ghosts? Or are they just the inevitable detritus of a drowned world? Perhaps the answer is both. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. What we call ghosts are often just memories that refuse to fade, traces of the past that persist despite our efforts to move on, to progress, to build the future on the foundations of what came before. Gadd is a ghost in this sense. It haunts the collective memory of Nicholas County, of West Virginia, of everyone who pauses to consider what lies beneath the beautiful surface of the lake. The people of Gadd are mostly gone now. The children who splashed in McKee's Creek are elderly or dead. The families who were displaced have scattered to the four winds. their descendants likely unaware of the town their ancestors called home. But the town itself remains. Drowned, yes. Erased from the maps, yes. Largely forgotten, yes. But not gone. Never quite gone. Every 10 years, when the lake drops for inspections, GAD rises from the depths. The roads emerge from the mud. The foundations become visible. For a few weeks, you can walk where the town once stood, can find the marbles left behind by children who are now grandparents or who have passed on themselves, can touch the rock carvings made by hands that are now dust. Then the water rises again, and Gilead returns to the darkness. Is it a town that was sacrificed, or a town that refuses to stay buried? Was the drowning an act of salvation, or an act of theft? Perhaps, after all these years, the answer depends on who you ask. Perhaps it depends on whether your family left that valley with a government check, or stayed behind to watch the water rise. Perhaps it depends on whether you live downstream in a home the dam has protected, or whether your ancestors lie in a cemetery that had to be moved to higher ground. Some questions have no final answers. Some stories have no endings. The water holds its secrets. The night stretches on. And somewhere in the depths of Summersville Lake, Gilead waits, patient as stone, quiet as the grave, eternal as memory itself.